So today we're going to do some biblical apologetics, and thanks to the wonders of the English language, I get to explain what I mean by apologetics. Apologetics is not where you apologize for your beliefs and say, I'm sorry for believing the Bible. Apologetics is where you explain to someone why you believe the Bible. You're explaining your beliefs to someone. So this teaching is going to be something that we could all hopefully use in our apologetics, because we deal with people all the time that don't necessarily believe the things that we believe about the Bible. I'm talking about what we're doing, trying to keep both ends of the book, the Old and the New Testaments, together in harmony. The mainstream tells us that when we get into the Old Testament commandments, we don't have to keep part of the commandments. The mainstream will tell us that there's the ceremonial laws, the civil laws or civic, and the moral commandments. And in modern day times as believers, we only have to keep the moral commandments. So we're going to explore what that means today. And on the video thumbnail, which you can't see here, but you'll see it on the YouTube video eventually, I chose a stained glass representation of the Ten Commandments. And I thought it was so classic. There are 10 commandments. There's 2 tablets of stone. And they have Roman numerals on the tablets. They have 3 on the first, they have 4 on the first, and then they have 6 on the second. So whoever made that stained glass mock-up of the 10 Commandments thought, instead of just doing 5 and 5, for some arbitrary reason, let's do 4 and 6. So it kind of sets up what we're talking about here. When we divide the commandments up a certain way, sometimes it's based on just their own personal agendas or interpretations. So we're going to talk about morality. When we talk about the mainstream Christianity, and I was kind of inspired. I used to say triggered. Triggered has such baggage with it. I was triggered, to say such and such. I'm just saying inspired these days. But I was inspired by the passing of Voddie Baucham. Voddie Baucham was a Baptist pastor that I had immense respect for, do have immense respect for. Don't agree on some things, but I don't have any doubt that he will be, hopefully, in Yahweh's presence in the hereafter. But he did a video a while back responding to a pink-haired LGBTQ type person on TikTok who was making the point that the LGBTQ agenda is okay because if you're going to say that, because there are commandments in the Torah that specifically speak out against that and condemn it, if you're going to say that it's wrong based on the grounds that it's in the Bible, why aren't you keeping the other commandments? Why aren't you eating clean? Why aren't you obeying Leviticus 11? Why are you mixing wool and flax and whatever? Why do you have mixed fabrics, et cetera, et cetera? And it was a valid point. And so Voddie Baucham did this whole video, and he responded by basically saying, well, you misunderstand. See, there's these divisions. There's the moral law, there's the ceremonial, there's the civil law. We as Christians only have to keep the moral law. This is part of that moral law. The stuff that you're talking about, eating clean, the holy days, etc., that's not part of the moral law, so it doesn't apply to us anymore. That's how he got out of it. Now, I agree with what the TikToker said. If you're going to be consistent, be consistent. Because the moment we start to divide up the commandments into these apply, these don't, then we're making arbitrary judgment calls based on our own personal preferences. So we're going to take a look at morality. Morality basically just means, moral means basically right or correct. If something is moral, it's correct, it's right. So morality is a system that we use to define what is right and wrong. And everybody has their own system, their own framework of morality. It's just natural, it's intrinsic to us, and there's nothing wrong with that. There's no way around it. But we have to harmonize what we see as morality with what the Father sees as morality. That's where we get into trouble. So the way I see it, there are 3 basic types of morality. There's absolute morality. There's what scholars call divine command theory, which is a type of morality. That's basically saying something is right or wrong because God says so. That's the only defining factor, whether or not he says. And then there's personal morality. That's what I think is right and wrong. And so to kind of illustrate this and show how you can't just pull out a certain thing and say these are the moral laws that we all should keep, how messy this is, I'm going to give 3 examples that we're going to walk through that sort of loosely identify with each of these types of morality. But by the time we're done, I'm hoping to illustrate just how much trouble we can get ourselves into when we start to go down this road. So let's start off with Genesis. We're going to go to Genesis chapter 4. Who can tell me what happened in Genesis 4 without looking? That's correct. Yep. We have humanity's first murder. Humanity's first murder. Now, this is going to be what I'm going to look at this under the umbrella of absolute morality. When I say absolute morality, this is basically, unless you're a complete psychopath or something's broken in your mind, we all just naturally know certain things are right and wrong. We all naturally know you don't murder somebody. You don't steal their stuff. You don't do things like that. You don't kidnap somebody. We just kind of naturally know these are boundaries that as good, decent humans, we don't cross. We don't need somebody to tell us. They're absolute. So Genesis 4, let's read the first 16 verses. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, I've gotten a man-child with the help of Yahweh. Again, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Abel was a keeper of flocks, but Cain was a tiller of the ground. So it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to Yahweh of the fruit of the ground. Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. Yahweh had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and for his offering, he had no regard. So Cain became very angry, and his countenance fell. Then Yahweh said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? If you do well or right, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. Then Yahweh said to Cain, where is Abel your brother? As if he didn't know. And he said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? He said, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened up its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you cultivate the ground, it will no longer yield its strength to you. You will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth. Cain said to Yahweh, my punishment is too great to bear. Behold, you have driven me this day from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden, and I will be a vagrant and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. So Yahweh said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance will be taken on him sevenfold. Yahweh appointed a sign for Cain so that no one finding him would slay him. Then Cain went out of the presence of Yahweh and settled in the land of Nod, east of Eden. So there's some things to consider here. We're told, and we won't get into this level of detail, but we're told over in 1 John that sin is transgression of the Torah. Specifically says it. So the question is here, did Yahweh communicate to Cain that murder was wrong or that it would be sin? We don't have any documentation of it. It's not in the text. That's why I say this is absolute morality. Cain should have known that it would have been wrong to kill his brother, and I believe he did. And because he let himself get so angry and so worked up, he chose to cross that boundary anyway. And Yahweh told him ahead of time, if you don't get yourself together, you're going to do this thing that is wrong, and there's going to be consequences. And Cain went ahead with it anyway. Now, the part that I typically tend to not focus on, and I tried to intentionally focus on when I read it this time as in preparation for this teaching, is that this is also one of the very first times, not only is this the first murder, but we know from the Torah later on that murderers get the death penalty. That's the command. Now notice how Cain committed murder, but he did not get the death penalty. So for whatever reason, even though at this point in history, murder was considered morally wrong in the absolute sense, there was no capital punishment for it. And we could say that this very first murderer was really the first person to obviously be shown mercy. Now we could say that Adam and Eve were shown mercy on some level, and I believe they were, But this is a person who clearly earned his own death. And Yahweh let him go anyway. And he actually put something in place that would protect him from being murdered by other people, because it's a slippery slope. Once somebody does something wrong, the next person has permission to do that wrong thing. That's how we function. So, Cain did it. So, but at the same time, there's no deterrent. Cain got away with murder. Nobody killed Cain, so now maybe I can get, and we see Lamech doing this later. But anyway, so this is something I would say falls under absolute morality. Pretty much everybody can agree that what Cain did was wrong. It was immoral. He shouldn't have done it. Open and shut. Pretty easy to deal with. Okay? So we have other things that we could read, but this one to me sets it up pretty nicely. Now let's take a look at divine command. These are commandments that are not obvious. Like, we're here keeping the Sabbath today. And Sabbath is one of those commands that the mainstream would say is not a moral commandment. The mainstream would say that Sabbath would be ceremonial, probably because it has to do with worship. Sabbath is something where you have specific sacrifices in the tabernacle or temple. There are specific things you can and cannot do on Sabbath. There are also things that Sabbath does that impacts the regulation and administration of government. So Sabbath kind of overlaps what would be called civil and ceremonial commands. But the average mainstream Christian is never going to look at Sabbath, although I should kind of correct myself. The tide is turning on this a little bit, thanks to Charlie Kirk being so open about Sabbath before his passing. People are starting to actually look at Sabbath seriously now, which is a good thing. But factoring that specific angle out, generally speaking, Christianity doesn't look at keeping the Sabbath as a right and wrong moral thing. Nobody's thinking of it in terms of just we should all do it or we should not do it because it's just obviously right. So this is a divine command. Let's take a look at 1 Chronicles. Now we're going to take a look at, this is not related to Sabbath, but it is an example of a divine command. 1 Chronicles, let's read chapter 13. 1 Chronicles comes before 2 Chronicles. 1 Chronicles chapter 13. We'll read the whole chapter. This is about a tragic incident. And this is where we start to see things get murky when we start talking about morality. Because when we talk about there, in this case, just like with Cain, there was something that Cain did, and then there was something that Yahweh did in response. Here we're going to have something that poor Uzzah did and something that Yahweh did in response. And we're going to start to see where morality gets a little messy here. Then David consulted with the captains of the thousands and the hundreds, even with every leader. David said to all the assembly of Israel, "If it seems good to you," personal morality, "and if it is from Yahweh our Elohim, let us send everyone to our kinsmen who remain in all the land of Israel, also to the priests and Levites who are with them in their cities with pasture lands, that they may meet with us. Let us bring back the ark of our Elohim to us, for we did not seek it in the days of Saul." Then all the assembly said that they would do so, for the thing was right in the eyes of all the people. Okay? So the people, in their own sense of morality, collectively say, you know what? It would be a good thing for us to get the ark involved because it's been off to the side for so long, and they are, for the right reasons, sincerely trying to come back into a proper relationship with Yahweh. They're trying to do something good. Then, so verse 5. So David assembled all Israel together from the Shihor of Egypt, even to the entrance of Hamat, to bring the ark of Elohim from Kiriath Jearim. David and all Israel went up to Baalah, that is, to Kiriath Jearim, which belongs to Judah, to bring up from there the ark of Elohim, Yahweh, who is enthroned above the cherubim, where his name is called. They carried the ark of Elohim on a new cart from the house of Abinadab, and Uzzah and Ahio drove the cart. David and all Israel were celebrating before Elohim with all their might, even with songs and with lyres, harps, tambourines, cymbals, and with trumpets. These are all good things to do. When they came up to the threshing floor of Kidon, Uzzah put out his hand to hold the ark because the oxen nearly upset it. The anger of Yahweh burned against Uzzah, so he struck him down because he put out his hand to the ark, and he died there before Elohim. Then David became angry because of Yahweh's outburst against Uzzah, and he called that place Perez Uzzah to this day. David was afraid of Elohim that day, saying, "How can I bring the ark of Elohim home to me?" So David did not take the ark with him to the city of David, but took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Thus the ark of Elohim remained with the family of Obed-Edom in his house 3 months, and Yahweh blessed the family of Obed-Edom with all that he had. So here's something. Now, we're going to skip over to chapter 15 in a minute and see the conclusion of how this thing goes. But this is something where the people, especially poor Uzzah, were trying to do something that was morally good. Worshiping Yahweh and being excited about worshiping Yahweh is a morally good thing to do. It's a right thing to do. And Uzzah is, in his reverence for Yahweh, when the ark starts to kind of totter and it looks like it's going to fall over, he does what any of us would do if we're honest with ourselves. He reaches out, probably reflexively, just instinctively, and tries to stop it. But the problem is that prior to this, neither David nor the priests had taken the time to inquire of what Yahweh thought was right in this case. How does Yahweh want us to do this? Now, there's a commandment, and it's a divine command. Yahweh tells the kings. First off, he doesn't want us to have kings. But if you're going to have a king, because we are anyway, because we're stubborn, your king is supposed to write his own copy of the Torah. Now, if David had done that, Uzzah would have survived this because the ark would have been carried properly. But this tells us that neither David nor the priest had any clue on how the ark was supposed to be transported. So they are trying to do what's right. But Yahweh had already told Israel what was right by divine command on how to carry the ark. So they were doing something moral in their eyes, but in Yahweh's eyes, they did something immoral. Now, granted, he knows our hearts. He knew why they were doing it, but they still transgressed. So let's go over to chapter 15, and we'll read the first 5 verses to kind of just see the overall outcome of this. Chapter 15, 1 through 5. Now David built houses for himself in the city of David and prepared a place for the ark of Elohim and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, "No one is to carry the ark of Elohim but the Levites, for Yahweh chose them to carry the ark of Elohim and to minister to him forever." And David assembled all Israel at Jerusalem to bring up the ark of Yahweh to its place which he had prepared for it. David gathered together the sons of Aaron and Levites, and then he just names a bunch of names here. We don't have to read it any further. Well, that's not true. Let's skip down. Let's go to verse 12. He said to them, "You are the heads of the father's household of the Levites. Consecrate yourselves, both you and your relatives, that you may bring up the ark of Yahweh." I put 1 through 5. I should have put 1 through 15. That you may bring up the ark of Yahweh, Elohim of Israel, to the place that I have prepared for it. Because you did not carry it at the first, Yahweh our Elohim made an outburst on us, for we did not seek him according to the ordinance. So the priests and the Levites consecrated themselves to bring up the ark of Yahweh, Elohim of Israel. Then the sons of the Levites carried the ark of Elohim on their shoulders with the poles thereon, as Moses had commanded according to the word of Yahweh. So it doesn't talk about them doing this, but logically at some point they went back to the drawing board. Like, what happened? What was our root cause failure here? What happened? And they figured it out. They were supposed to carry the ark on poles, and it was supposed to be done only by Levites. Now, Uzzah, he was responding because it was on an ox cart. So, they're kind of figuring out what went wrong. But David basically acknowledges that, yes, we were trying to do the right thing, but we transgressed. And so this is a case where, again, like I said, it gets murky. A man died. A man died. Now, your average mainstream person is not going to think of this as a moral command. Like Vodi Bakum, if I was to ask him, is it a moral law, a civil law, or a ceremonial law for the Levites to carry the Ark of the Covenant on poles? He would probably say ceremonial, because it has to do with the tabernacle system, it has to do with the Levites. That stuff gets all put under ceremonial. So, do you get capital punishment for ceremonial. Like, I can understand capital punishment for something like murder. I can understand capital punishment for kidnapping, which is actually in the Torah. That is a capital offense. I can see it for things like that. But the fact that Yahweh killed a man over a ceremonial commandment doesn't really track with what we would call morality. And so this is why I'm saying this, when we start to go down this road of dividing up the commandments this way, it's a very, very dangerously slippery slope. Now, one thing David used, he used the word ordinance here. The correct way to divide up the commands, if you're going to do it, in our English, it uses the word laws, commandments, statutes, and ordinances. Each of those has a type of specific legal type definition. If you think about an ordinance is something, as I understand it, and my understanding could be incomplete, but as I understand it, when Moses went up on Mount Sinai, everything that Yahweh told him to do was called commandments and laws. When he comes down from Mount Sinai and they're out in the wilderness and life is happening, Yahweh gives more commandments. Some of those, like wearing tassels, that happened after Mount Sinai. That would be considered an ordinance. Okay, this, telling the Levites to carry the ark on poles, happened after Mount Sinai. So, well, after they came down, this is when they started to do it. So, but then statutes, that's where something like, I think of like the daughters of Zelophehad. You know, all the men in the family had died and it was just the women left, and they're like, well, what do we do about inheritance? Don't we get any inheritance? And Yahweh made a ruling through the judicial system, through Moses. He establishes the 70 judges, and we're told that when those judges make a ruling, you are obligated to abide by it. That's a statute. That's a commandment that came by way of response to a situation. So this thing happened. Now I want you to do this in response. Okay, so this is how the scriptures divide up the commandments. Let's take a look at a personal morality. Now this one gets really messy. I love it. Let's just roll around in the muddy mess of this next example and really, really think about it. Let's go to Numbers. This is another case of capital punishment. Now I mentioned earlier that the average Christian would consider Sabbath not to be a moral command, because if they did, they would be keeping the Sabbath. They consider it probably some overlap of civil or ceremonial. Let's read Numbers 15, and let's start in verse 32. Numbers 15, 32. While the sons of Israel were in the wilderness, they found a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him gathering wood brought him to Moses and Aaron and to all the congregation. They put him in custody because it had not been declared what should be done to him. Then Yahweh said to Moses, the man shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones outside the camp. So all the congregation brought him outside the camp and stoned him to death with stones, just as Yahweh had commanded Moses. Yahweh also spoke to Moses, saying, speak to the sons of Israel and tell them that they shall make for themselves tassels. I just mentioned this, on the corners of their garments throughout their generations. They shall put a tassel on each corner with a cord of blue. It shall be a tassel for you to look at, to remember all the commandments of Yahweh, and so as to do them, and to not follow after your own heart and your own eyes, personal morality, after which you played the harlot. Why? So that you may remember to do all my commandments and be holy to your Elohim. I am Yahweh your Elohim, who brought you out from the land of Egypt to be your Elohim. I am Yahweh your Elohim. So here, Sabbath and the regulations regarding Sabbath: don't go to work, have a holy convocation, don't kindle a fire, things like this. These are divine commands. Some random person out in the world does not have a sense of morality that includes that. This is something that we do because Yahweh said this is the right thing to do. Yahweh said to set apart the seventh day, to hallow it, make it holy, and treat it with a certain reverence. And this man, in his own morality, said, I know that Yahweh said that it's wrong for me to do this on the seventh day of the week, but I don't see a problem with it. It's right to me. So this man chose to use his own personal sense of morality to override Yahweh's morality in his decision making. And this ceremonial, this civic command being violated was worthy of capital punishment in Yahweh's eyes. Yahweh wasn't thinking like, well, he didn't violate a moral command, so his punishment will be, I'll give him a little slap on the wrist and make him pay restitution. No, Yahweh wanted him stoned to death for what the average mainstream Christian would not call a moral command. And that's why I say this is really messy when we start to go down this road. When we start to say, well, this command is moral, so therefore I have to do it. This command is civil, so maybe if it suits me, but it's not moral, so I don't have to. These over here, all these ones that I don't want to do because they make me look Jewish, or people think I look funny wearing these goofy white things on my garments or whatever. Those are all ceremonial. That's just for Israel when they had national boundaries and they had a government and all this stuff in the scriptures. That's not us today. So those all get pushed over here, and I don't have to do them. And of course, I have to bring up Brad Scott, because I always do, and his box of evil. You could put box of morality, whatever you want. It's this whole idea of, in his case, a box of evil. You make a box, and we're going to define what's evil by putting things in that box. So like Satan goes in that box. Hitler goes in that box. Ted Bundy goes in that box. Chairman Mao, whatever you want to put in that box, only the things in that box are evil. And of course, because we're so good at doing things like this, the stuff that we want to do, we put outside that box. Because the stuff that we want to do, well, it can't be evil. It's me doing it. That's personal morality. And we do the same thing when it comes to right and wrong, typically. We will find ways to justify the things that we want to do by excluding them from immorality, excluding them from wrong. We will make them right in a way to excuse us from being accountable for doing them. And this is one of the biggest traps that we fall into. And so when it comes to apologetics, and those have been in the walk longer, most of the grown-ups here, if not all the grown-ups here, have probably thought about this on some level. So in some way, I'm kind of targeting the younger crowd on this, because as you guys get older and you start to interact with more and more people, you're going to be asked questions. Well, why do you do things why do you do that? Why don't you do this? One of my daughters in her job was asked, about eating marshmallows, and she had to explain, I can't eat the marshmallows because they have gelatin in them. The gelatin probably is derived from pork. Oh, okay. That's a form of apologetics. You're explaining what you believe. But when it comes to this, like Leviticus 11, nobody's looking at Leviticus 11 and saying it's moral. Leviticus 11, if I was to classify it under this, I would classify it under divine command. And Yahweh says specifically in Leviticus 11, I want you to do these things to be holy. I had a conversation with a brother the other day. He was talking about how, explaining to people how, well, we don't eat pig because it has parasites and pigs don't sweat and things like this. And it's like, that's dangerous, because every year we have a study that comes out and says that eggs are bad for us. And then the next year, eggs are good for us. One year, butter is good for us. And then the next year, butter will kill you, And it's like, this is what happens. All you need is a study to come out and say that something's good or bad. So when we start talking about our health, and we point to studies that show pork is bad for us, we set ourselves up, because somebody can just prevent a study that says, well, this group says that scientifically pork is actually good for you because it has these phytonutrients. And we've sabotaged our own case. But when we can point to morality and say, I do Leviticus 11 because my Creator told me to, period, full stop, I don't need to explain any further, now we're yielding to divine command morality. Now it doesn't matter if there's a physical, logical reason, it's right. And this takes me to the core of what I'm saying here. Every single commandment, regardless of the context, is a moral commandment. Regardless. Some of the commandments that Yahweh gave have an underlying sense of absolute morality, like murder, theft, things like that. He doesn't need to tell us those things are wrong for us to know, but he did anyway. And that was kind of a mercy, because he takes some of the guesswork out of it, but it also does something to hold us accountable. Because those of us who have this book and read it, we can't claim ignorance. We can't say, I didn't know murder was wrong because you never told me. Yeah, he told us. When we get into other stuff, Sabbath, the holy days, eating clean, things as simple as we have an acre of property, and it's interesting the way some of the boundaries are marked. We have 2 drive shafts that mark 2 of the corners of our property. And several years ago, we got up one morning and one of them was missing, was gone. Like, who stole the drive shaft that was, like, what? Did this person need a drive shaft that badly? Maybe they had been watching Forged by Fire or something and they were going to melt it down and make a sword out of it. I don't know. But anyway, it was just like somebody stole our boundary marker, which is you're commanded not to move your neighbor's boundary marker. Now, stealing the drive shaft was not equivalent to moving it, but it was there to mark our property. So it's kind of related. And somehow or other, we think it was through one of our other neighbors that got back to this person that we were upset. So we got up one morning and the drive shaft was back. I guess he didn't need it that bad after all. But anyway, things like that, like our neighbor apparently thought it was okay. It was moral to him to take our property marker. But Yahweh has a specific commandment that says don't do that. So if we yield to Yahweh's sense of morality, we're going to be automatically keeping all the commands that are in accordance with absolute morality. We're going to be doing the things that please Him in the sense of divine command morality. And our own personal morality we have a choice to make there. Like the guy that went out and gathered the sticks, we can choose to elevate our own personal sense of right and wrong above Yahweh's and say, well, his ways don't make any sense. Mine makes more sense, so we can do that. Or we can consciously, intently work to align our sense of personal morality with His divine command, absolute morality. And to me, when you do the Torah, that's where you end up having to go logically if you're going to be consistent. Because if you don't do that consistently, you end up like Vodi Bakum, where you have to jump through flaming hoops of doctrinal, fire to try to justify what you're doing and not doing. You have to figure out ways to apologize for why you're not doing things that look right. You have pink-haired weirdos on TikTok that are actually making a more logical case for keeping the Torah than you are. And I think it was Zach Bauer. He did a video several years ago, kind of the same thing. There was a Christian author that came out and basically just said, look, we're in the New Covenant now. We're in the New Testament now. We don't have to do, the Old Testament stuff anymore. So therefore, it's okay to have, we'll keep it PG. We'll just say non-conventional relationships. And Zach was like, yeah, this is where this goes. The moment we start to say, I don't have to do this commandment, I don't have to do this commandment, then we've just opened up the floodgates where we can just pick and choose whatever we want to do. And we end up in a situation where, and I thought it was really great how the songs had kind of a theme, exalting Yahweh's name. And we're not talking about just the Tetragrammaton, Yod-He-Wah-He, because even then we can't agree on how to pronounce that. But we can agree that He has absolute authority. We can agree that His reputation is the most important reputation to uphold. We can agree on those things regardless of how we say His name verbally. And so when we get into morality, I'm going to do a teaching on this in the next few months, but the idea of truth. In English, the word truth, trust, and betroth all come from the same root. So truth has to do relationship. It has to do with one thing having a relationship with another thing, just like betrothal. And betrothal is covenantal. And so I think with truth, and I'll elaborate on this later, there's a higher ideal. Think of it like a blueprint or something, a schematic. That is the ideal, and we are working to match that. We are trying to sync up with it in a way that when two people enter into a covenant together, they are synced up and unified around a certain framework. So if we can identify Yahweh's framework of morality and sync up with that, that's ultimate truth. And I think that's where the goal is here. So I wanted to put this out there just as a way to say, the next time someone says, we only have to keep the moral commands, and these are only 3 cases. I could have brought up a whole bunch more. Everybody can find cases like, really, we just have to keep the moral commands? let's take a look at that. Let's take a look at Uzzah. Let's talk about how the moral commands played into his untimely demise. And to me, when we start doing this, it's really easy to just tear that thing down. It's really easy to just to say, look, you have to either decide you're just going to throw the whole thing out and say, look, I'm just going to do everything with my own morality, period, that's it. Or I'm going to do everything according to Yahweh's morality. Because the middle ground, that's the danger zone. And that's where we look hypocritical. That's where we look like people who are selfishly interpreting the word to meet our own ends. And I don't want to be guilty of that. I don't think any of you want to be guilty of that. And so things like this are ways that we can hopefully kind of work to overcome these stigmas. Like Leviticus 11. There's nothing wrong. There's nothing harmful with eating clean. Like, I've been eating clean my whole adult life, and I've never once been harmed by it. I've never gotten sick. I never woke up one morning with my side locks grown out speaking Yiddish. I'm not Jewish. It didn't turn me Jewish. It's not a problem to be Jewish, but for some people it is on a theological level. I disagree to a point, but anyway, so I wanted to put this out there just kind of as an encouragement, like I said, especially for the youngsters, as you encounter these kinds of things. Every single thing that Yahweh says to do or not do is moral. If He says to do it, you have a moral imperative to do it. If He says not to do it, you have a moral imperative not to do it. And if we just make it that simple, in the 90s, people used to say, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. I like to say, keep it simple, saints. This thing really is simple. And theologians, seminaries, these types of scholars that just like to, it's like if you think about, there's a scholar that I'm familiar with, I won't get into too much, but he wrote a book several years ago called Against Criticism. And at the time, he was in college at Oxford to be a literary scholar. And of course, when you're a literary scholar, you read, let's say Moby Dick. Okay, as an example, classic piece of literature. You read Moby Dick, and what do? You dissect it. You take it apart little piece by piece, and you microanalyze little themes and character development and da-da-da-da-da. When you start to do things like that, you zoom in so much that you can't enjoy the story anymore. It's like, I don't want to dissect my wife and pick her apart into little tiny pieces to be able to enjoy and understand her. I want to enjoy my wife as she is, as a whole. And I think that when we start to get into little things like this, where we're starting to pick apart our theology and these little things, and we get into like documentary hypothesis and all this stuff like the scholars do, they zoom in so much that they're completely missing the forest for the trees. They're completely missing the big picture of what this book can do to our lives. This book isn't something here to be a specimen. And I hate the word theology, just on a personal rant, because all the other ologies, geology, what are you doing? You're studying the earth. Why? So you can manipulate it. If you think about all the biology, same thing, you're studying life. Why? So you can manipulate it. That's what science does. It wants to understand something so it can manipulate it. I don't want to understand Yahweh in the ology kind of way. I want to understand Yahweh in the covenantal kind of way, like a husband and wife kind of thing, or like a brother-sister kind of thing, or a friend kind of way, relationally. And I think that when we stop trying to like pick apart His word and we just accept it for what it is as a whole, that's the only way we're going to achieve that. So hopefully this was helpful. I think this was short. I think it was I did go under an hour, I think. Awesome. So at this point, we'll go ahead and open the floor for questions, comments, and strong opinions, with the caveat that the strong opinions are relevant to the teaching, because sometimes that gets me in trouble. And if anybody has any personal testimony of where you've dealt with somebody that has done this, and you've had some apologetic work to do, not I'm sorry for my beliefs, but let me explain my beliefs, I'd be happy to hear that, because especially for these youngsters, the world is getting crazier and crazier, and they have kind of an uphill battle ahead of them. Things like this, I think, are useful in how they interact with the world.